Sitting to my left and right are the consul, or left and left, are the consul generals of Egypt and Israel, and I'll introduce the consul general of Egypt, and Ursula will introduce the consul general of Israel. If you were here yesterday, you had the pleasure of hearing the consul general of Egypt, Mr. Alaa Issa. He's been consul general here in Houston since 2010, but he's held a range of positions with the Egyptian government, including Deputy Assistant Minister for Legal Affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Counselor at the Permanent Representation of Egypt to the United Nations, and Director of Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Bureau. Aside from his diplomatic positions, Mr. Issa has been a fellow and an associate at the Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. He has a law degree from Cairo University, an MA from the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts University, as well as an LLM from the law school at Columbia University. Ursula. Oh, Ursula.
Okay. It's my pleasure to introduce Meir Shlomo. Thank you. I have a loud voice, but not maybe that loud. He is a current Consul General of Israel to the Southwest. I have to emphasize this, not only to Houston. And he had many distinguished posts. He was already on the American continent as a diplomat. He was assigned to El Salvador and to Peru. Then he jumped over to Europe, to Denmark, and he also served in India. And prior to coming to Houston, he was Consul General in Boston. So it's also his second term in the States, and I think both what they have in common, among other things, Mr. Issa and Mr. Shlomo, are that they are very familiar with U.S. policy and with the country here.
What we'll do is pose a couple of questions. I'll go first to the consul generals, and then Ursula will. Okay, thank you. First, it's a very broad framing type of question that I'd like to begin with. And the question is this: how has the overall situation in the Middle East changed in the past decade? Mr. Shlomo, why don't we begin with you?
You want the short version or the...
Cliff notes would be good.
Yeah. Good afternoon, and I want first to thank University of Steve F. Austin, specifically Dean Murphy and Dr. Ursula Consul, and of course all of you for coming here today and taking your time. Indeed, it's a very broad question, and I will just try to sort of put a few maybe clips, like you said, Brian, and not go too deep into it. And anyway, we are diplomats and not academics, so we can afford it. I think the most obvious thing in the last decade, especially to me as somebody who lives in Israel, is of course that the religious factor has become much more visible in the Middle East altogether. I don't want to go into value judgments, and I don't want to go into all the particulars that in the last panel they did very scholarly about this faction or another faction. But I think it would be fair to say that religious is much more of a topic, not per se as a religion, but also as a political tool, with political manifestations, with political consequences. We certainly, from our point of view in Israel, see it and feel it. A discourse that, a lot of the discourse that used to be about trying to figure out political or territorial or whatever other issues has gone into also the religious aspect of it. Some may think it's good, some may think it's bad. I'm not going to judge about it, at least not right now, but I think it's a huge factor and a huge change in the Middle East, and we have to realize that it's probably there to stay for quite a while. The other thing that we noticed is something that may have sort of escaped a little bit from the eye of the public, is that prior to the Arab Spring, we could see in the last 3-4 years before the Arab Spring a very different camps in the Middle East altogether. Certainly not anymore the Arab world versus Israel, but surprisingly, a coalition of moderate countries versus a coalition of radical countries. And in the moderate countries, I would like to put all the Gulf countries for that matter, Saudi Arabia, of course Egypt and Israel. And on the radical, it will come to you as no surprise, of course, Iran and Syria were, and to some extent maybe some other countries, but they were the most leading. And that was not a coalition per se, a coalition of a formal coalition, but I would say coalition that was shared by common interests. And what was interesting is that some of the parties in the coalition, especially of the moderate part, realized, and not only realized, but acted on it as they were supposed to act and try to bring the moderate voice into the discourse of the Middle East. And the last one, which I will really touch very briefly, because I think almost the whole conference touched upon it, is, of course, the most obviously the Arab Spring, that nobody really knows where it's going to. But I think there are two obvious things that we can already see happening out of the Arab Spring. Again, no value judgment, but first of all is the fragmentation that is starting to take place in Iraq, in Syria. Definitely it's a possibility. Today's car bomb in Lebanon is another indication that something might even be happening in Lebanon. Hopefully not, but that is the reality. And the other one is, at least for the time being, instability. Instability and uncertainty. We, all of us here, and I don't think if somebody will tell you that he knows where this thing is going, you can actually think that he actually knows it. I think it will be far-fetching. And that by itself creates uncertainty and instability. And again, whether it's a kind of an interim phase or whether it's there to stay, nobody really knows. But I think as we sit now, these are the two main things that are happening, fragmentation and instability and uncertainty, that are the direct, immediate consequences, at least for the short term, out of the Arab Spring. Thank you.
Mr. Issa?
Thank you all. Very quickly, to pick up where Shlomo left off, two things I think have been critical in the past decade, amongst others, but those are the two issues I wish to highlight. They're by no means only two. One is that there was increased liberalization in the political regimes generally in the Middle East over the past decade. The Arab Spring did not simply spring from nowhere. It came as a result of specifically some regimes in Egypt, in Syria, that had over the past 10, 15 years slowly permitted greater degrees of liberalization. Gradually, cracks appeared in those regimes, in the authoritarian nature of the regime. These cracks, in turn, created different factions in the regime, and with an increased level of liberalization, different segments of societies were able to use them, and the entire effect was pushing like a seam which is cracked and then it just continues to grow wider. There was increased liberalization. One could see it in Egypt from 10, 15 years ago. The media was much more liberal, much more critical of government. Today we have the Muslim Brotherhood, who is the biggest political party, which have had the biggest majority in parliament in the elections of this year. But we forget that in 1995 they managed to get hold of 25% of parliament. And that was because of the increasingly liberal regime in Egypt. Over the past 3 years, we've seen even the regime in Syria, cracks begin to appear in the regime. Key members of the regime leaving Syria 4 years ago. The vice president of Syria sought asylum in France and started an opposition. And these effects have, I think, a cumulative effect in that it's not so much what has happened in the past 10 years, but the fact is that this trend will continue. There will be increased political liberalization in the Middle East. It will be much more difficult to revert to purely authoritarian regimes over the coming decade. There certainly will be attempts. It's by no means a sure result that the transition will continue towards democracy. In fact, there may be regression, but I think the effect of what has been going on in society, in state-society relations over the past 10 years, is that it will be very difficult to revert to strong authoritarian regimes such as existed in the 70s and 80s. The other impact I'd like to, issue which I think has had a significant impact, and I'll give an example of Egypt. It may be less evident in other countries, but the conservatism, political conservatism and religious conservatism, and that really has become much more visible during the past decade. But the roots of that conservatism lay much deeper. They really, one has to look to the mid-70s up to the mid-90s to see where that conservatism came from. One important element, not by all means not the only one, but one important element has been the tremendous number of Egyptians or Syrians, for that matter, who have gone to work in the Gulf with their families, lived in the Gulf for a number of years, came back, migrant workers, and then were replaced by other workers and so forth, and came back, unable to scale the ladder of social mobility because of a number of reasons, economic as well as societal, coming back with a more conservative outlook on religion as a result of the number of years they have spent in the Gulf, which specifically in Saudi Arabia or Qatar, and coming to fruition really as these groups, well, they're not groups, I mean, as they really started to coalesce into schools of thought and then eventually take on some form of political manifestation during the past 4 or 5 years. These are two key issues which I think have happened in the Middle East and have been visible during the past 10 years. One last thing, a third element which I'll introduce, but certainly is that equally the technology and the internet have made people more aware, certainly made people more able to interact with a more liberal environment, and therefore create significant challenges for regimes and for states as they try to control society, or as they even try to interact with society towards state building and the nation building process. Thank you.
So our next question actually asks a nucleus what the whole conference is about. So I apologize that we look at you like for the source of wisdom. What would you identify as the strengths and weaknesses of the current relationship between the United States and the Middle East? So this is what this conference is all about, right?
Yeah, you know, a lot of times people who meet me for a short first meeting, they ask me, how long are you going to stay here? And I always say that if I don't do something really foolish, I'll be here 4 years. So in a way, this question may get me to do something very foolish by going after any administration or any current U.S. policy. So I will try to shy away from this one. But that's not the only reason. The other reason is that I truly believe that there is some kind of a fundamental myopia, if you would like, that has to do also actually with the very thing that you're an expert with, the cross-cultural differences. And again, it's not about any value judgment, and it's not about saying that this culture is better than the other culture, but cultures are different. And we have to recognize that, and we have to work with that and understand that even when we think we know something, it's not necessarily actually understanding it. And I'll just give you a few apolitical differences that I find that create some kind of misunderstandings between the West, not only the United States. And I would put Israel also into it because I think we suffer from the same problem also, maybe less so, but we also find ourselves victims of the same phenomena. First of all, the convention that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Not true in the Middle East. Maybe true, but not necessarily true. Probably not a working assumption you can build coalitions and grand scheme of... we learned it the hard way. Hopefully others will learn it without going through the hard way. But definitely, the assumption that if you help somebody who is against your enemy, that means that in a year or so you'll be going for a honeymoon together. Not the case. Again, it may happen. I'm not saying that it's never the case. I'm just saying that we shouldn't take it for granted. And we have the tendency to do it. Another one is this attitude that you find that is part of the culture, that there's always a deal to be made. Here's the problem. Let's analyze it. This is A, this is B. How do we get from A and B? And there's always a way to get from A and B. Maybe this side will be a little bit less, the other side a little bit more, but there's always a deal to be brokered. Again, in the Middle East, not necessarily true. Sometimes there is no deal to be brokered. There is no deal to reach, and as unpleasant as it is, we have to recognize it and maybe stop for a while and reevaluate where are we going and what is it that we want to do about it. But there's certainly no this deterministic approach that there's always a deal, and as long as both sides are reasonable, we can always make it happen. And that brought a lot of agony into a lot of policymakers on the West. The other thing is that compromise is not always what it appears to be, and it's a lot of time in the eye of the beholder to understand what the compromise is all about. It's not only about the generosity of the strong party. Sometimes it's construed actually as a weakness of the party who is offering the compromise. So while we all like compromises, especially diplomats, I guess, sometimes it sends the wrong message. Again, not all the times. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look for compromise and just look for how to solve things in other ways. But we have to understand that what we mean is not necessarily what the other side actually gets from this communication. In Israel, we deal with it all the time, that on one hand, we're trying to seek peace and offer more compromises. On the other hand, we don't want to lose our deterrence, which actually is our survival kit, if you would like. And we have to play between these things, that our quest of peace will not be misunderstood by some as a sign of weakness. And that's a constant debate. I cannot tell you what's the right formula. I cannot tell you where does it stop and where does it start. But it's definitely something that we should be very mindful of. And the last thing, in order not to take all the time, the psychological factor goes a very, 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 very long way in the Middle East. You can really, really not exaggerate the importance of the psychological factor in conflicts in the Middle East. And we tend to do it because the Western society is much more rational and less emotional about issues altogether. I mean, this word business-like, what does it mean if not, let's put the emotions on the side and deal with the facts. Again, in the Middle East, it doesn't make any difference, good or bad. It's different, and we should recognize it. And I think the best example actually is what Egypt did. A single appearance of Sadat in Jerusalem, which was nothing to do with tangible concessions or tangible changes, but it made all the difference in putting this psychological factor and psychological barrier between Israel and Egypt down. And I think President Sadat ought to get all the credits that he got, but we should recognize it again and again because it was not a simple thing to do. But he understood that the psychological factor is a huge one, and it has to be dealt with. And it's not only about territory and another installation here, another installation there. It's about something that we really, really have to relate to. Thanks.
I have one point, I think. I think the biggest weakness, which I think is also coming to the fore now, is maybe possibly in the future being an issue that will be strengthened, is has always been, and understandably so, the very little public, people-to-people connection between the U.S. and Middle Eastern societies in general. To the extent that there has been official interaction, of course, it has always been through institutions, through regimes, but be it U.S. aid or U.S. cooperation. And understandably so, when there is such cooperation, individuals need to identify with other individuals, not simply at a personal level, but you initiate cooperation with an institution, you initiate interaction with an institution, you provide aid to an institution, because ultimately you are accountable. Either you are accountable financially or you are accountable in terms of the results you produce, just as this conference, at the end of the day, after we've all gone home, I'm sure Professor Murphy will have to be accountable to the university. Well, what are the results of this conference? What have we gotten from it? What will have our students benefit, and so forth? But there has to be some form of accountability. Accountability is something that is much easier to achieve when you're dealing with institutions, because you really know the parameters of what you're dealing with. When I was growing up in Cairo, university, college years, early 80s, the American Cultural Center, which was part of the U.S. Embassy but in a separate building, was a venue that we frequented very often. They would air, before the era of internet or even Blockbuster and all of these video rental places became, but there would be movie showings, not commercial movies, but good quality movies. Second, you could go to the library and simply read the newspapers or the magazines, which were far too expensive for anyone to buy because of the foreign exchange. Books, you could borrow books from it. And twice a month, every fortnight, there would be a cultural salon, so to speak, where issues would be discussed. What may be even more surprising, that it wasn't simply frequented by students or individuals from the middle class or the educated middle class, but even the lower middle class, who really were looking for an outlet for education, for interaction, for cultural interaction, were really the prime visitors to the American Cultural Center. As a result of the security situation in the Middle East in general, the Cultural Center was closed down over 10, 15 years ago. And there is no U.S. Cultural Center in Cairo. I don't know of other Middle Eastern cities. Maybe there is still, but I doubt it, quite frankly. And the people-to-people, that interaction with the people in the Middle East is no longer there, not even at the official's very minute level that it was. I mean, how many people frequented the American Cultural Center? 2,000, 20,000 a year in a country of a population of 60 million. That's not much, but still. But that's no longer there. But I think part of the result of what's been happening over the past year or two is beginning to highlight the importance of reaching out and interacting with people in the Middle East. It's not simply sufficient to interact with the regimes, with the officials, but you need to interact with society to even understand what's going on in society. Maybe that is something that one should be optimistic for the future. Should be optimistic about for the coming future, for the coming decade or two. I would hope so. I really don't know whether that will happen or not. But I think people-to-people interaction is something that is ultimately has been the weakness, and hopefully in future maybe a strength.
Thank you. One question we haven't really delved into too much. Does the possibility exist for promoting cooperation among the various countries of the Middle East despite their differences? By what mechanisms could you envision meaningful cooperation?
I got actually a short answer for this one, and for a reason. Sure, there are ways and mechanisms to have cooperation between countries in the Middle East. The most obvious example is probably what happened in the early 90s when we had what we call the multilateral track in the peace talks between Israel and the Arab world, where we try to put a track that doesn't have anything to do with politics and deals only with issues such as environment, water, migration of birds, if you would like, all the elements that had nothing to do with politics. And the idea was, of course, that not only that we would like to have cooperation on this, but this cooperation in turn will create an interest of the parties to maybe even to induce them to jump over the political hurdle. So it was like a two-folded strategy. A, to have a cooperation on these issues, and B, to make these issues as another factor in driving the parties together. The fact of the matter that now, about 20 years later, most of this cooperation did not survive. The other fact is that some of it did survive, because environmental issues don't have borders, and they tend to upset us. So some of it is so necessary that we find ourselves still cooperating, happily so. But the truth is that most of it has collapsed. And it has collapsed because there was no will to sustain it, at least no political will. And I'm not an expert on global, I'm not even an expert of Middle East, but I think I can make the observation that without political, at least certain political will, and also will within the societies themselves, it is very hard to sustain such a cross-boundaries process. Unfortunately, the political factor has still too much power in order to put down apolitical things that have a very positive, and that brings me to the last point, and that's why I have a very short answer. I really think that is, and I think the previous panel spoke about it when they mentioned words like accountability, self-responsibility. It has to come from within, to a certain degree. We cannot just make something out of nothing in this case. There has to be some kind of understanding, interest, and willingness to support it within the societies and countries involved. Sometimes you just get the idea. Aaron Miller termed this thing as the theory of maturity of conflicts, that sometimes one side or both sides are not ready in order to understand that it's in their best interest to get over this political issue and get to the next stage. I think actually that in the Middle East, at least in the last 5, 6, 7 years, it started to go the right way in a promising way, but there has to be a real will of the leaders and the societies to overcome it in order to, it's not just some kind of a technical issue, what is the mechanism and what is the right mechanism, should we have conferences or super committees, or it's not. It's first and foremost a political question in the Middle East, and only then you can actually, if you want it to be viable, you can really deal with it.
I'm afraid I don't have as good an answer as Meir does. I'm sure the possibility exists, but I'm sure it will also eventually, if there is any meaningful cooperation between sides, it will really have to be market-driven. It will have to be need-driven, by a need to cooperate, be it at the official level or at the private sector level. If it hasn't materialized, perhaps it's because there really are no current avenues that, for the market to induce cooperation, or maybe there are, but really the political differences among the states are just far too significant. And I do not mean just between Israel or the Arab countries. I mean even between countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia. I mean, where you've got the entire Gulf countries for the past 10, 12 years now are realigning their labor policies towards decreasing their reliance on labor, be it educated or unskilled labor, from Arab countries, and directing it towards South Asia, for instance. And issues which at the official level have been causing problems, and which states have not, at the official level, haven't been able to overcome. So to conclude, I think whatever cooperation may come will really have to be market-driven, and if there is a strong need, then that cooperation will come.
I think there are two things that will probably still be there as shaping this relationship. One is the practical one, energy. It's where a lot of the energy of the Western world comes from. It will always be a consideration and very high on the agenda of national security. And the other thing is, of course, the ideological, the D word that was mentioned on and off during this conference, which is something that the West looks very highly upon, and not necessarily everybody else. So these are two factors that are going to be there all the time. But I want to say something as far as the future, a very limited thing, but I want to mention two terms. One is leadership and one is soft power. I think that if you think about Eastern Europe, the democracy, I mean, it's almost a miracle what happened in Eastern Europe in the sense of all these countries, or most of them at least, going democratic in the real sense of the word. And when you take it a little bit down to history, you would see that there were actually people, I mean, can you imagine actually people sitting in Russia or Czechoslovakia or one of those countries and risking their life in order to listen to a rock concert on the radio or to the BBC News? I mean, doesn't that strike you like something that no sane person will do? But still they did it. And the reason that they did it is that the United States mainly, and the Western society, but mainly the United States, I think it would be fair to say, has created this incredible attraction to its values. And that is what all soft power is all about. It's about not getting physical power in order to make the other side do what you want, but actually attracting so much the other side that it will do what you want. If you want, you can think about marriage, at least in the early stages, in this example. But I think that the United States and the Western world have to keep their values and to keep their attraction. That doesn't mean not to respect other values. That doesn't mean not to have conversation about values. But it's not the right way also to give up so quickly one's values only to get some kind of a short-living compromise. So I think this is probably the most potent thing that the United States have in this battle is its own values and the attraction that these values create within other societies to be the same. And that brings me to the other word, leadership. Without getting into too many details, I think it will be fair to say that the region as a whole is suffering for a lack of leadership or a lack of creative leadership in the last 10, 15 years, unfortunately. And this even brings more the role that people aspire from the United States to be the leader. The United States is the leader of the world. The United States has this power for better or worse. And there's real expectation of people, I think everywhere, including the Middle East, that the United States will assume effectively, courageously, in a statement fashion and not in a political fashion, this historic responsibility that sometimes you may not want to do it, but if you want America exceptionalism, it goes both ways, and it carries responsibility on the other hand. So I think the amount of leadership and the attraction of this soft power or values of one society is something that is direly needed in this dialogue or in this relationship between the U.S. and the Arab world and the Muslim world altogether. Thanks.
I would venture to say that the future direction in the relationship will be tense. There will be crises. There is regime changes in many countries in the Middle East. States are facing internal challenges, and some of the regime changes which are taking place are very significant in terms of the form of the regimes that will appear. And there will be crises with the U.S. and between the U.S. and many and countries of the Middle East, and those crises will be resolved. But quite frankly, I would venture to put my money on what is termed of the soft power, that the positive values that exist in the U.S. society, not necessarily the state, but in U.S. society and its economy, will continue to be a magnet for individuals from the Middle East to aspire to, either to interact with or to emulate or to copy in their own societies. Educational values, market values, labor values, employment values, ethics, work, and so forth, management values. And I think this is something that will be an undercurrent. However, it will be overshadowed in the news, in the media, by most probably recurring crises, which will be unfortunate, but crises happen and we deal with them. I'm an Egyptian diplomat. 4 weeks ago, there were massive demonstrations outside the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, people scaling the walls because of a movie that came out in the U.S. that was against Islam. Well, you can logically ask, well, why were people protesting against the U.S.? It wasn't the movie produced by the U.S. government. It wasn't the Obama administration that produced the movie. It wasn't the U.S. Embassy in Cairo that was circulating or distributing the movie. It happened to be an American citizen. Well, fine. The U.S. government itself doesn't have anything to do with that, has no responsibility to shoulder, because if one is to take that approach, then possibly if an Egyptian citizen is killed for some reason and he happens to be Christian, then we can expect demonstrations in Rome outside the Egyptian embassy and people scaling the walls of the Egyptian embassy. So we will face crisis and we will deal with them and we will overcome them eventually. I mean, and it's unfortunate, but it's part of everyday life. But I think the magnet of the soft power, of the values that this country stands for, will, I think, continue to be a very strong undercurrent in the relationship in future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. We only have a couple of minutes, but does anyone from the audience have a question?
What do you see the impact of NGOs having on various countries in the Middle East? Is it net positive? Is it net negative? And is it changing? If so, how?
My answer is clearer in my mind if I frame it not so much in NGOs, but I frame it in terms of civil society, as I look at NGOs as part of civil society. And the Hegel's concept of the civil society and its role. If I look at Egypt, the role of civil society has been tremendous in mediating the difference between state and the population, between state and society. It has been not just socially, but even politically. And in that sense, as I look at the role of civil society, I would argue that it will continue to be stronger. It will play a more important role because of also the liberalized, more liberal atmosphere, which will be difficult to repress again, quite frankly. I would, if I were a betting man, I would bet my money on that civil society will have a stronger role to play in future in countries in the Middle East. That's the best answer I can give. I hope it's sufficient.
I think I will pick from where Alaa stopped, but and I think it was discussed actually before in other panels, but NGOs cannot function out of nowhere if the society is totally unprepared for or uneducated. That means that it doesn't have the kind of environment that will let it function. For example, freedom of speech or freedom of unionizing or whatever. To some extent, the idea of just putting NGOs in societies that are not democratic at all, I'm not sure it's a great idea. I mean, I know that it's been used as a tool of creating this idea or another idea, but when it's done within a society that can not only cope with it, but also enjoy it and understand the importance of it, it's definitely a useful tool. All that I have to say in the sake of transparency that we are both government people and NGO is not high on our agenda. We are for the G, not for the N. But you can see more and more all over the world that they have a tremendous important effect wherever society is adequate in order to give them the chance to flourish.
Great. We have one more question.
My question is, what kind of relationship could Egypt expect with the United States if somehow the Muslim Brotherhood comes to power?
They are in power.
They are in power.
They are in power, and I guess you can say that it will not be any different. You may manage it differently. You may have different expectations, but will the core of that relationship change? I don't think so.
A quick question and a comment. I would suggest that what we have before us is a great example of two very adept, experienced diplomats working on the front line of honor for their respective societies to the mutual advantage of their society and also in consonance with the interests of the United States. It's a very positive thing for us to see, to have you two gentlemen here together. My question is, the relations between Israel and Egypt have been profoundly important and a positive factor in the region for many years. Could you venture any projections? Granted, we can't predict the future, and the past is tough too. That was a great point. But could you venture any thoughts about the future of that relationship and the implications of that continuing relationship for the region?
If I were to venture a guess about, let me say, an educated guess, not an official position on the future of that relationship, I would say that it will continue as it has been, simply because peace between Egypt and Israel has strategic importance for both countries from each one from its own perspective. Each is a net beneficiary of that peace, and based on that calculus, that's why that peace between them has held for the past 30 years, and why I would guess, if I were to try to guess, that it will hold for many years to come.
I totally agree that peace between Israel and Egypt is the cornerstone of stability of the Middle East, or at least of the moderate camp in the Middle East. I cannot exaggerate the importance it has to Israel and to Egypt. We've seen that it went through a lot of crisis before the Arab Spring and survived it. And the Arab Spring, we saw that at least by now, not only that there is no change, but actually it's one of these things that when there is no change, it's good news. So in this aspect, no news is good news. I just want to mention that what was mentioned yesterday, that as we sit here, 2 days ago, the new Egyptian ambassador, dispatched by the president from the Muslim Brotherhood, presented his credential on the part of President Morsi to President Shimon Peres. And that's not something that we should take lightly. It's a very strong indication. We have all the reasons in the world to keep this peace. But, within accordance of what I said earlier, in the sake of, there's always a possibility that something can go wrong. I, for one, think that we are all very, very hopeful, and I think we have a pretty good reason by now to be hopeful that, it may be, we may have ups and downs down the road, but I don't see anything as dramatic as really reversing this incredible achievement, I think, of both countries, and it's incredible achievement for the Middle East altogether.
Well, I'd like to thank our two consul generals, and if you don't mind giving them a round of applause for their frankness